Leaders who lead by telling are not doing it out of any evil desire. They're thinking this is the best way. But when they begin to see that telling actually limits my ability to grow staff, and so the leader who leads with questions, that staff comes with a problem. Instead of solving it, saying, tell me more. What do you think you might do? What are some other options? And helps them figure it out, is actually developing a leader.
Welcome to Leadership, the podcast where leadership meets real-world insights. In each episode, you can eavesdrop on exclusive conversations with top thought leaders, best-selling authors, and experts in leadership, communication, relationships, culture, and everything else that shapes your effectiveness in the workplace and in your personal life. Leadership is here for you. Now, here's our host, himself a seasoned coach and best-selling author, Dr. Roger Dean Duncan.
Hello, folks. Welcome to Leadership. As you've been following our podcast, you notice that I love to sit down with smart people and ask them a lot of questions. In this episode, I'll be talking with yet another smart person, and in this case, it's a smart person whose lifelong focus has been on the value of good questions. Bob Tiede has been on the staff of Cru, formerly known as Campus Crusade for Christ, for 54 years. For the past 2 decades, he's been on the organization's leadership development team. Bob's blog, you'll find it at leadingwithquestions.com, is now in its 12th year. It's followed by leaders in more than 200 countries. Bob has written 6 popular books, including Great Leaders Ask Questions, and Now That's a Great Question. His most recent book is the 3rd edition of Leading with Questions. Bob says his mission is to help leaders everywhere multiply their leadership effectiveness tenfold by moving from let me tell you to let me ask you. In fact, his entire focus is on the idea that leadership is not so much about knowing the right answers as it is about asking the right questions. Bob Tiede, welcome to Leadership.
Roger, I'm delighted to be here.
Bob, if you would, tell us what experience or observation triggered your interest in questions?
Well, Roger, great question. When people hear I have this blog and I've written all these books, they could think that asking questions must just come naturally to Bob. And whenever I speak, I always start with a confession. And my confession, Roger, is that for most of my career, I was a benevolent dictator. My only paradigm of leadership was I thought the job of a leader was to figure out what needed to be done and then to tell his or her staff what they needed to do. I did say benevolent dictator. I grew up in a home where I was taught to say please and thank you. So, Roger, if you've been on my team, I don't think I ever would have said, hey, Roger, go do this. It would have been more like, hey, Roger, here's what we're working on. It'd really be great if you could please do this. And when you did it, I would have said thank you. At a staff meeting, Roger, stand up. You all need to hear what Roger did. And so appreciation was expressed. And I don't want to suggest we got nothing done, but I am confessing I only had one paradigm of leadership. The job of a leader was to figure out what needs to be done and then to kindly tell your staff what you needed them to do. Now, that changed for me in 2006 when I found the first edition of Leading with Questions by Dr. Michael McCourt. Roger, like you, I love books. I love leadership books. And my wife loves to go to bookstores. She goes all over, but when she knows when she's done, I'll still be in the leadership section. And I usually try to find 2 or 3 books that I haven't seen before that look interesting, find a chair, peruse them to see if anyone's going home. Well, in 2006, the first edition of Leading with Questions went home. It was a page turner. And as I read that book, filled with stories of leaders literally from around the globe, not just the U.S., and sharing the questions they were using, I had only one question. Why hasn't anyone ever shared this leadership paradigm with me before? And so, Roger, that's what started me on that journey. I was already on the U.S. leadership development team. I began to teach out of the book, put an 8-session seminar together. And it was just so well received. Roger, so many people like me, yeah, we know there's questions, but we've never seen it as a leadership tool. And once a leader sees it, I believe, it's kind of like they'll never not see it again. Leaders who've been, like I was, only leading by telling, haven't chosen that because they've examined leading with questions and rejected it. It's because they've never seen leading with questions. And once they see it, very few ever say, no, I don't want to do that.
Well, what role does mindset play in a person's ability or even willingness to ask good questions, to transition from, as you said you did, from being a benevolent dictator to someone who asks questions? What kind of mindset is required?
Well, again, in thinking the best of people, and I love to think the best, leaders who lead by telling are not doing it out of any evil intent. They're really doing it because they don't know a better way. They've never heard or even thought there might be a better way. And, one story I love to tell is a number of years ago, I was attending a leadership conference, and I noticed that Liz Wiseman, the author of the book Multipliers, was one of the speakers. Now, I walked into her session thinking, man, this is going to be great. Multipliers. She must be talking about leaders like me. Well, she started her talk talking about diminishers. And I thought, well, at first, that certainly wouldn't apply to me. But then she began to give examples of what diminisher leaders do. She said, for example, when you bring a diminisher leader a problem, they solve it for you. And I thought, well, wait, what? I love to solve problems. I love it when my staff came with problems. And especially when I clearly knew, here's how you could solve it. And I thought they were walking out my door thinking, wow, I'm so glad I brought that problem to Bob. He had the perfect solution. But wait a minute. Liz Wiseman said that was a diminisher quality. And that multiplier leaders ask questions so that their staff can figure out the answers on their own. And then second, she said, when you bring a diminisher leader a new idea, they say, wow, but Roger, if you also did this, this, and this, it would add horsepower to that idea. And again, Roger, I thought, well, I love it when my staff bring ideas and when I can add horsepower. I love to add horsepower to ideas. I had no, today it's called emotional intelligence. I had no emotional intelligence to know that many of my staff probably left those meetings thinking, I'm never bringing Bob another idea. No matter what I ever share with him, it's never good enough. He's always got to tell me what I need to do to make it great. And so your question about mindset, I think we have to be exposed. Again, I started with saying, I don't think leaders lead with telling out of any evil desire. They're thinking this is the best way. But when they begin to see that telling actually limits my ability to grow staff. Someone once said, if you solve all the problems, you actually will gather a group of followers. But then they said, but isn't the idea of leadership to develop more leaders?
Exactly.
And so the leader who leads with questions, that staff comes with a problem. Instead of solving it, saying, tell me more. What do you think you might do? What are some other options? Which of the options you think is best? What would be your first steps? What's the plan to move from here to solve? And helps them figure it out is actually developing a leader. And once I believe a leader sees that, I think many of them almost instantly embrace it. And it's kind of like, hey, show me how to do that, because it just makes sense.
And then they're wondering why they didn't figure that out a long time ago, because it feels very natural once you do it. Well, Bob, what's your advice on framing questions to get the best results?
A couple of things. And frankly, Roger, I'd love your thoughts on the same question. So it's not like, hey, I have the right answer. I've got a perspective, but part of leading with questions is welcoming others into the conversation. But just a couple thoughts is number one, I always like to say, hey, Roger, I have a question. In other words, I know that many times people's minds may actually be 1,000 miles away. So instead of just throwing the question where they might end up saying, wait, what? It's like, hey, Roger, can I ask you a question? And then the second thing I like to ask is, hey, I'm curious. And then, there's a lot of different ways, but I like to use the word might. Roger, here's a situation. What do you think we might do? Now, I say might versus should do. Because if I say, Roger, what should we do? That can sound like there's only one right answer. And you might think, I'm not sure I know what we, for sure should do. And so you might say, gosh, Bob, I don't know. But if I say, Roger, what might we do? Well, then you're free more to throw out ideas. And of course, you've got to thank people for their ideas. And I love to use the simple follow-up question. In other words, hey, Roger, what might we do? And you give me an answer. I say, wow, Roger, say more about that.
Right.
And that kind of thing. But that creates that. But at the same time, if you have been the benevolent dictator, you really haven't welcomed, you haven't asked questions, you may catch your staff off guard. It's kind of like, hey, what's going on here?
Yeah, what trick is he playing this time?
Yes. And so, don't give up. It may take a while. Don't give up the first time you ask and say, well, that didn't work. They didn't give me anything. You have to continue to ask, continue to communicate curiosity. And then when they do answer, appreciation.
Yes, I've seen, and I'm sure you have, so-called leaders whose idea of asking a question is to ask a gotcha question.
Yes.
And if that's been their operational style, if they're trying to transition to become a different kind of leader, one who leads by asking questions rather than telling people, they can't expect people to buy into it immediately. As you just suggested, it might come across as, what kind of trick is he playing on me now?
Yeah.
So that tells me that someone who's making that transition needs to be patient with himself and needs to really hang in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A story that illustrates that is a number of years ago, we were taking one of our leadership development groups. Our headquarters is in Orlando, and we took them on the behind-the-scenes leadership tour at Walt Disney World. I knew during the day we were going to go to the underground of the Magic Kingdom. We were going to go to in Epcot, where all employees are called cast members,
right,
where the cast members come to change into costumes. And looking forward to this. But when we got on the bus, they said our first stop is going to be Walt Disney Laundry Services. And I thought to myself, you got to be kidding. Why would we want to go to laundry services? I mean, it's like, I hope this is short and we get on to the exciting things. Well, Roger, it turned out that while the whole day was great, that first stop was the best stop of the whole day. Because there we heard the story that at Walt Disney World, they were experiencing in the laundry services an 85% annual turnover. They felt we were doing such a bad job that we probably should outsource laundry services. And then they got new leadership who began to lead with questions. And they began to ask the cast members there, what could we do to make your jobs easier? What ideas do you have that would make everything more effective? Now, Roger, they said that they had to ask that question for several months.
Oh, boy.
Because the staff thought it was a trick.
Yes.
The staff thought if we answer and say something negative, out the door we will go. So there's an example of it took quite a while before trust was developed. And then, I think sometimes we think as leaders, well, if I ask, their answer may be to request something ridiculous. So, I don't want to ask for fear that they're going to be unreasonable in their demand. Well, I don't know if that was the case there or not, but when they began to respond, the staff said, first of all, it's hot in here.
I'm sure it was.
Is there any way that each of us could have an air conditioner vent blowing right over our workstation? And the leadership thought, wow, sure, that's a reasonable request. The second thing they said is, we spend a large part of our day folding stuff, folding sheets, folding towels, folding napkins. And only a few of us are the ideal height for the table height. Some of us are a bit tall and our backs hurt having to lean over. And some of us are a bit short and, we're having to reach up. Is there any way that this table could move up and down so that everyone could have an ideal surface given their height? Well, again, leadership, none of whom had ever folded anything, thought, wow, that's a reasonable request. And so, yes, both those things were granted. And there was other input. Well, at any rate, fast forward. Today, turnover in laundry services is less than 15% a year. Staff come and stay. And it all started when leadership started asking questions. But as I shared, it took a while to develop the atmosphere where the staff, the cast members, actually felt it was safe to answer.
And when you think about it, those things seemed so obvious, but maybe they weren't obvious unless you were working in the laundry and having to reach up or reach down and sweat all day.
Yeah, exactly.
Simple questions and then listening for the answer.
Yes.
So what do you think are the most common mistakes that leaders make when asking questions? And how do those mistakes impact team performance?
There's several.
Yeah, I would say the first mistake is they don't ask enough questions.
Yes.
But when they do ask questions, what are some common mistakes?
Here's a few that I've observed. And number one is they ask the question, get an answer, and move on. Now, what's wrong with that? Research shows that when we're asked a question, we instinctively, again, this isn't with a great deal of thought, but when we're asked a question, especially sharing an opinion, we instinctively roll out a safe answer to test the waters.
Right, right.
And that's not everything we could say, but we're kind of testing the water. So a leader who asks a question, here's that first answer and moves on, actually doesn't get to their gold nugget, their best thought. And so a leader says, wow, that's really good, Roger. Say more about that. In other words, by digging a little more, first of all, when that staff member hears, hey, that's really good, Roger, they relax. It's like, wow, my supervisor appreciates what I'm sharing. This is a safe space. And hey, say more about that. Now they'll say more. And you actually, get to their gold nugget. I actually find it's kind of asking the third and fourth question. Wow, that's really good. Can I take notes? Please continue. That you get to their very best thought. So that's one thing. Don't just ask the question and move on. Ask the question, get that first answer, and then ask them to say more about that. Because now you've established that you're really interested in what they have to say. Second thing, it's what I call don't hijack the conversation. Meaning we ask something and they say, well, here's this idea. And we think, oh yeah, I'm familiar with that idea. And so we immediately jump in and tell them what we know about that idea.
Right, right.
And again, we have to grow in emotional intelligence. When a staff member hears that, again, they may not say anything, but the feeling they're walking away with is, oh yeah, the boss is a smart guy and I'm not. And that limits what they're going to say. And plus, hey, as a leader, you already know what you just are, going to add horsepower. That's not new information. but wanting to mine for that gold nugget that they have. And
Well,
so
or it could also come across as I'm a smart guy, but the boss doesn't care,
yes,
which is
yes,
also deadly.
yes. Another thing I think that's a common mistake is we don't give them adequate time to speak or to think before they speak. We ask a question, and research shows that the average person, when we ask a question, we only wait 2 or 3 seconds for an answer. That silence, if they're not immediately speaking, is so deafening that we feel compelled. Again, it's instinctive. We feel compelled to fill the air with more words. So we'll either ask another question, answer the question ourselves, or just move on. And the key to that is ask your question, keep comfortable eyesight, but not intense, and relax and count to yourself 1001, 1002. I would say at least to 1008. There's times I've gone to 1030. But truly, the longer the silence, the better the answer. They will answer. And at that point, then you'll be the beneficiary. But again, being aware that we instinctively want to fill the air when there's silence.
Well, and one value of that silence is that it sends the signal that you really are interested in the answer.
Yes.
And you're going to be patient as they formulate the answer. You're not in a hurry. You're not going to rush them.
Exactly. Good input, Roger.
Can you share an example of a single powerful question that dramatically changed the direction of a team or project? Now, that question at Disney, that clearly was an example.
Yeah. Roger, this could seem simplistic, and but I have another story that will answer the question. William Marriott, founder of Marriott, says there's 4 words that he thinks are the most important words in the English language. And he tells a story way before he founded Marriott. He's 22, an ensign in the Navy, and he comes home to the Marriott farm, which is in Virginia, I think, but not far from D.C.
Right.
And he comes home for the weekend, and his dad had invited then President Eisenhower to come pheasant hunting on the Marriott farm. And I believe President Eisenhower arrived on Friday night, and Saturday morning it turns out to be cold, windy, and rainy. And they're sitting at the breakfast table kind of talking, what should we do? Bill Marriott said that he was standing at the fireplace, and President Eisenhower got up, came over to the fireplace and said, Bill, what do you think?
The President of the United States.
and Bill, reflecting on that later, thought, wow, thinking back to Eisenhower leading the Allied troops in World War II, he had to deal with Churchill, de Gaulle, Montgomery, the British general. I'm sure there was a French general. He had to deal with his own generals. How did he do it? Well, one of the things was Eisenhower loved to say, what do you think? And listen, now, he didn't promise to make follow every piece of advice that he might have received, but he was interested. And for me, one of the greatest questions is, hey, what do you think? What do you think we might do here? I mean, what do you think there's a topic? Obviously back to that morning, hey, what do you think? And Bill Marriott said, Mr. President, I think we ought to stay inside by the fire. And President Eisenhower said, sounds good. And that's what they did. But, fast forward, here's Bill Marriott, founder of Marriott, considers the 4 most important words to be asking people he interacts, his staff, by asking, what do you think? It's so simple, but why does it work? Roger, I'll ask you a question. How have you felt anytime you've had a leader, somebody you reported to, supervisor, whatever their title was? How did it feel when they said, hey, Roger, what do you think we should do?
Well, I've been glad they asked because that's what they hired me for.
Yeah.
They didn't hire me just to take orders. They hired me to help solve problems, to help notice where there's an issue. And I've told this story before. When I was head of global communication at Campbell Soup Company, we had a CEO who was excellent at asking questions of anybody and at any level in the organization, and would actually listen to the responses. And he was enormously effective and frankly was very popular and was trusted very much by everyone, because he would ask those kinds of questions. In fact, occasionally he would ask that very question, "What do you think?" People came to understand that he really cared. It wasn't just rhetorical. It wasn't just some technique. It really mattered to him. So he had extremely high trust, and the people around him all of them were very bright people. And because of his personality and his building trust in that culture, they were allowed and encouraged to use their smarts.
Yeah.
Whereas under a previous CEO, they would click their heels and salute and didn't have a whole lot to say. And so they frankly weren't able to add value as much as they did under this second CEO. It makes all the difference in the world.
Roger, I can't help myself. I'm sure under his leadership, the staff were saying, good.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. That's true.
The Campbell Soup jingle, the motto, you heard it on all those ads.
Oh, sure. Well, it's still used.
Yes. But, there's another quote that I love. Henry David Thoreau said, "The greatest compliment ever paid me was when one asked me what I thought and then attended to my answer."
Yes.
And, I just love the way he worded that.
That one comment is a sermon.
Yes. Yes.
Now, some organizational cultures discourage asking questions. What are the telltale signs of that? And talk to us a little bit about the potential cost.
Well, the potential cost is huge. Roger, you said it. You hire smart people so they can give you input. And so when you have a leadership culture or a company culture that discourages asking questions, you're not making use of all the brain power. One of the illustrations of this that I use when I'm speaking is I have 2 PowerPoint slides. These are easy to imagine. And I get somebody in the audience to ask if I can ask them a couple questions. And on the first slide, it's a big canoe. Like a really big canoe, and there's like 15 staff on that canoe, and everyone has an oar, and they're all, you can see it's a still picture, but they're
right.
They're oaring like mad. And I say to this person, "Now you're the leader of this team, and you want to get that canoe across the lake as quick as possible. How many of them do you want to have row with you?" And of course, the answer is all of them. And I say, "No, I know that's a silly question. Of course, all of them." I said, "But here's the next picture. This is your same team, but now it's a team of people gathered around a large conference table. And the word opportunity is written on the table. And I say, now listen carefully. If you're a leader like I used to be, the benevolent dictator, and you think it's your job to figure out how to take advantage of the opportunity, and then you're going to tell them what to do, how many mental oars are in the water? Only one, only yours. But if you're a leader who leads with questions, and so you share the opportunity, and then, looking around that table, you say, "Gang, what do you all think we might do?" Now, how many mental oars are in the water? Well, hopefully 15. In other words, the whole team. And I say, what are the odds that one of your staff might have an idea better than anything you were thinking? And of course, they always say, well, yeah. The odds are really good that would be. And I say, it's not a guarantee, but just because you're hearing from all these ideas, the probability is there, isn't it? And I say, now let's just imagine that seated across the table, one of your staff, her name is Sarah, and she shares an idea, and you think, wow, that is so much better than anything I was thinking. And so you look Sarah in the eye and say, Sarah, love your idea. Would you be willing to execute on that for our team? And I say, how hard do you think Sarah will work? And they always say, really hard. And I say, whose idea is she executing? Hers. Yeah. And again, here's some emotional intelligence, Roger, that I confess I didn't always have. Maybe I think my idea is equal to Sarah's. But I realized if I let Sarah run with her idea, she's going to own it. And she's going to execute on her idea better than she would mine, even if I think mine is equal or a bit better. You know, one of my friends, he actually wrote the foreword to the book. Now, that's a great question. His name is Terrence Donahue. Terrence said, you know, when you give an order as a leader, when you tell your staff what to do, he said they might write it down, they might remember it, they might even execute on it. But he said they don't own it. But he said when you ask a question and you say, wow, Roger, love that idea, run with it. Because it was your answer, you own it. And there's tremendous value in staff owning it.
All those other people sitting around that table certainly noticed that Sarah broached an idea and then was given the opportunity to execute, and they will be more likely to broach good ideas in the future because you're creating that environment.
And Roger, another paradigm that might take place is Sarah shares that idea, and another staff member, rather than immediately the supervisor, says, wow, that's great. You know, we could also do this. And suddenly you're getting the fingerprints of the whole team on the idea.
Yes.
And the whole team, you know, moves forward. Depending on what it is, you may need the whole team to move forward in implementation. But if you can get their fingerprints on it where they feel like, who came up with this idea, rather than the boss or just one person, it's like, we did.
Exactly.
And now the whole team owns it.
Hey there, Leadership listeners. We have something special for you. As a thank you for tuning in, we're offering you a free copy of Roger Dean Duncan's award-winning best-selling book, Change Friendly Leadership. In this book, you'll discover a proven framework for leading change that people will actually buy into, without all the stress and resistance that often stand in the way. You'll also learn powerful strategies to improve relationships both at work and at home, creating a healthier, more productive environment for everyone. To claim your free copy, just head over to changefriendly.com. Don't miss out on this opportunity to transform your good intentions into great performance. Again, grab your free copy of this best-selling book at changefriendly.com.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about how to create an environment in which people feel safe in questioning the status quo, including challenges to the opinions of leaders. How do you create an environment where they're comfortable doing that?
You know, first of all, if that's not true presently, I don't know of any magic thing. You know, we go back to the Walt Disney World story. It will take time. It's not just, hey, if you'll just ask this question this way, bang, it'll work. It'll take time. But also, if you're wanting to move that direction, it's going to be really, really important how you respond the first time that a staff member asks a question. Staff member says, I've got an idea here. And, you know, if you're welcoming that, wow, thank you, David. Yes, please share that with me. Hey, say more about that. David, wow, this is really good. Thank you so much. Please continue to come with your ideas. And then also, as a leader, you might not be able to execute every idea or implement every idea, but it can't be a situation where you're just gathering ideas and nothing ever changes.
Right.
That'll create hopelessness also. And so one has to consider those ideas and be willing to implement the ones that you think are excellent. You know, I share the story of Navy Captain Michael D. Abershoff. When he took over command of the USS Benfold, one of our nation's modern warships, morale on that ship was the lowest of all. I think we have about 300 vessels in the U.S. Navy. Not quite sure how the Navy measures morale, but however they measured it, it was the lowest of all vessels. 18 months later, under his command, retest of morale on that ship was the highest of all ships in the U.S. Navy. He literally moved it from worst to first. How did he do that? Well, I'm sure he did a bunch of things, but the first thing he did was he scheduled 300 15-minute meetings with the 300 sailors on his ship. And in those 15-minute meetings, he asked them 3 questions. Now, these are so simple, you have them memorized upon hearing them one time. What do you like best about this ship? What do you like least? What would you change if you could? And the captain listened. At the end of the first day, Roger, he might have only had time to meet with 10 or 15 of those 300, but there was a buzz on the ship. The new captain, he's different. He's actually asking us.
Right.
Now, as he asked and listened, he did not make a promise to make every change he heard. But as he's hearing him, he's thinking to himself, what? What do you mean? We're going to fix that. But then, Roger, when he began to announce changes, called all the sailors together, and Roger, let's just say you'd been on a ship and you'd shared an idea. He'd say, Roger Dean Duncan, stand up. Roger, you shared this idea. Thank you. We're going to implement that. Now, Roger, how tall would you feel at that moment?
Feel pretty good.
Yeah. You'd feel 10 feet tall. And Roger, realize you're out on a ship, but at first opportunity to call Mama, what are you going to be telling Mama?
There's a chance I might mention that. Yes.
and Mama is going to be so proud. She's going to be telling everybody, you won't believe it. Roger called me. He gave an idea to the captain of his ship, and they're implementing it. Well, you just hear that story, and you realize, wow, culture changed. Captain asked, listened, and then implemented. Again, not every single idea, but people saw that it wasn't just a waste of their time to talk to the captain and nothing ever happened.
Well, piggybacking on what you've just said, Bob, I never served in the Navy, although I have a lot of Navy and Naval Academy people in my family. But I've served with Navy people many times in the nuclear power industry, as you may know. When a company owns several nuclear stations, they refer to it as a fleet. And the reason they refer to it as a fleet is because typically nuclear power stations are the leadership team comes from the U.S. Navy.
Yeah.
And I've done consulting and training and coaching at more than 40 nuclear stations in the U.S. and Canada. And I've seen some of these leaders who still think they're in the Navy and still have that mindset where they're just going to give orders and people click their heels. And the stakes are high because we have safety issues that are very, very critical. But I've seen many of those leaders make the transition to someone who asks questions, sincerely listens. And I've noticed that those are the nuclear stations that have the highest ratings on safety, productivity, production, all of the metrics. And I don't think it's coincidence. I think it's these leaders are bringing out the best in their people because they're doing exactly what you're talking about. I've seen it hundreds of times. They ask questions and they listen.
Absolutely.
Makes a difference.
There's another angle here, and that is how can the staff member, in other words, rather than the boss asking questions, how can we as a staff member ask the boss, the supervisor, questions?
Right.
Without threatening them, without it feeling threatening to them. And on that, I have a couple of suggestions. One is to say, Roger, I've got an idea. I'd love to ask a question of you. Permission to speak. Of course, Bob. What's the idea?
Right.
And then I love to preface it with saying, now, Roger, yes, I have an idea, but before I share it, I'm aware that you might know one or two more things than I know that if I knew would make this a bad idea. So please know that I have, no crystal ball here to say this is going to be just the perfect thought. But here we go. And so I share that idea. And what I'm suggesting when you position it that way is you're first asking permission to speak, so to speak, and a leader's going to say, sure. And then when you say, you might know one or two things more that I'm unaware of that would make this a bad idea, it then doesn't feel to the leader like you're challenging their authority. And what you're actually doing is creating a greater hearing, a greater openness for your idea to be heard. Because if a leader, and again, there's some emotional intelligence here, if a leader feels threatened, like you're trying to take over, they might be pouring cold water on what's really a great idea because they're feeling threatened. And so you're positioning your idea in such a way that they're not feeling threatened. But once they begin to see that you're also for them, you're wanting to help them win. You're wanting to help the team win. Again, over time, don't be surprised if that leader more and more says, hey, Roger, what do you think we ought to do here? Because they see you as someone who wants to help the team win, and not that you want their job and you're trying to oust them.
Right. Well, back to the nuclear example. At those nuclear stations where there was an environment of psychological safety, the physical safety was easier to manage because people felt comfortable bringing up issues. They didn't feel threatened. They didn't feel like they were going to be put down or chastised. So it goes back to that whole idea to create a culture where people are comfortable, have psychological safety, and feel that it's not only okay, but they're expected to ask questions, even challenging questions.
Yes, yes.
So let me ask this. How can good questions be used in conflict resolution situations?
Again, they certainly can. One kind of overarching thought in conflict resolution is I like to avoid asking why, because when I say, now, Roger, why did you make that decision? The why question always feels judgmental.
Yes.
And there are two other questions we can ask. And again, I don't have all the smarts to know why they just work better, but they don't feel threatening. And they get to the same point. And so instead of saying, Roger, why did you make that decision? Saying, using what or how? Saying, Roger, help me understand what caused you to make that decision? Or how did you come to that decision?
Right.
Just that simple adjustment of inserting what or how versus why tends to change the dynamic that you're really seeking to understand. Whereas when you ask the why question, it almost seems judgmental coming just right out of the gate. And so, especially in conflict resolution, you're wanting to communicate a posture that I'm not coming in saying, I know it all. I have all the facts. I know it all. I know the right decision. I know the judgment that needs to be made here. Don't need any further input. Generally, you get two sides locked in and you don't get resolution.
Right, right.
And so coming in with a posture of how and what, but also just even introducing, hey, I'm glad we can meet. I know we have a conflict here. And I'm guessing that if I knew everything that you were thinking, there might be some things that you're thinking or know that I just haven't understood. And so I'm wanting us to have resolution, but I'm also open to hearing what you think I might have missed.
Yes, excellent. So, Bob, how do you coach leaders to ask better questions during performance reviews or routine one-on-one meetings, which are very common between a leader and direct reports?
Well, again, a great question. My suggestion is kind of a dramatic paradigm shift. When we think about performance review, we often think, okay, my job as a supervisor is going to say, Roger, here's all your weaknesses you need to work on. And in other words, I'm here to provide correction and get you going in the right direction and point out all the things you're doing bad.
That's probably why many people dread those meetings.
Yes. And like I say, my suggestion is a whole different paradigm. It's asking these kind of questions. If you're the supervisor, it's these kind of questions. How can I help you? How are you doing? What's going well? And I love to on the what's going well, say more about that. And what else? In other words, let them talk about the things that are going well. It immediately creates, well, two things. You're hearing things you might not be aware of that are going well. And you get to celebrate with them on those things. But it also sets a context of you get to celebrate on those things. And then another question is, how can I support you? What resources can I provide? And then, what challenges are you facing? What's not going well? How could I help? But in other words, a context of starting with the what's going well and drilling down there and celebrating. And then also thinking that one-on-one time is for you to find out as a leader, what could I do to help? Versus it being a judgmental situation where you're called before the judge who's going to read you the riot act for all of the failures you have, all your weaknesses.
Yes.
And I'm also thinking a leader who works in this paradigm, instead of dreading those times, it actually becomes energizing. It's actually, wow, a way to encourage my staff, a way to find out, a way to celebrate. Also, again, I refer to emotional intelligence. That staff member leaves the meeting motivated. It's like, wow, love my boss, love my supervisor. Yeah, I'm eager to do even better. And then I also suggest, Roger, these one-on-one meetings, these review times is an opportunity for the staff member to also ask questions and to ask, positive questions like, what can I do for you? In other words, asking your supervisor, what can I do for you? How can I support you? What should I be prioritizing? How am I doing? What feedback do you have for me? In other words, asking the question, knowing that, they're probably wanting to give you some feedback, but make it easy for them to do it. Again, by asking the questions of, how can I support you? Again, you're creating a friendly conversation in which, at the end result, you're doing more to advance your career than you are in wanting to create a conflict in those kind of meetings.
I've always regarded those performance review meetings more about the performance of two people, not just one person. And I've found it helpful to ask the stop, start, and continue question, ask the direct report, is there anything I've been doing as your supervisor that would be helpful if I stopped doing? And make it safe for them to answer that honestly.
Yes.
What could I start doing that would be helpful to you and our team? And then finally, what are we doing together that you think we should continue doing? And when they realize that it's safe to answer those questions, they could ask the questions of themselves. And then that conversation becomes really rich. It's about the relationship It's not just about one person's performance.
Yeah.
It's about the relationship between two smart people. If you can create that kind of psychological safety, that conversation can be very rich and very helpful.
Roger, that goes, again, right down the path that I love. Creating a dialogue, a conversation, and not a session that's viewed as I'm here to judge you and I'm here to reprimand you and I'm here to point out all the failures you have and you better start working on these issues. And, everybody dreads that.
There should be no surprises in a conversation like that. Unfortunately, some of those one-on-one meetings or performance review meetings are, every 12 months or so. You need to have those conversations earlier. Now, how can leaders use questions to foster accountability without micromanaging?
Again, that's a great question. I think when you start with saying, "Hey, Roger, what do you think we might do here?" And again, leaders have asked me, "Well, what if the idea they share with you think is not very good?" I say, "Well, don't stop. Roger, that's an idea. What would be some other options?" And you're hoping that in some of the other options, there'd be one that you'd think, "Wow, that's pretty good." But you're also helping them think rather than just the first thought that came to them. We all at times need to come up with options to determine which one is best. So you start with options, but then also understanding what we've talked about earlier, that they will own their answers much more than if you insist that they use your idea and they don't actually own that idea. So at times having the emotional intelligence to say, letting Roger run with his idea as opposed to insisting he use my idea is going to have his whole heart. And so I want to make the choice that the wholehearted idea is going to be executed way better than my idea that doesn't have his or her heart. And so those are the kind of things that I'd be considering, of course, celebrating. And then because they're running with their idea, you asked about accountability. Roger, let's go with that. And you might do it in the meeting, or you might say, "Hey, Roger, it'd be helpful to me if you took a little time and came back to me tomorrow, kind of with the plan of how much by when, kind of this process with some due dates on how you'd like to execute your idea." And so when Roger comes back with those due dates that he authored, not me, the staff member authored, and again, if you looked at them and you thought they're unreasonably long or whatever, you can, of course, comment. But when you say, "Wow, Roger, that looks great." And again, my belief is that most staff want to do a great job, and most staff are terrific. They're not, trying to say, "Oh, well, here's one simple idea, and I want to get it done 3 years from now." They're usually over optimistic. And then as you check in on them, I like to ask this question as opposed to this one. Okay, what do I mean? Roger said, as a first step, here's what we want to do, and we want to have it done, 2 weeks from today. And so, I'm checking either 2 weeks from today or just prior to that, rather than, "Hey, Roger, did you get that done? Roger, tell me about your progress on that." Because all of us know at times we start on a step and sometimes it ends up being easier than we thought. Got it done in one day.
Right.
I've already moved on to the next step. Other times we realize, oh my gosh, I was over optimistic to think that could be done in 2 weeks. But rather than trying to make Roger feel like he's a failure, "Hey, Roger, how's that going? Tell me." I'm creating a safe space for Roger to give me an update and sharing why it might not have been done, and which keeps Roger motivated and moving forward, the staff member. So those are a couple of thoughts on creating accountability, but doing it in a way that's not heavy-handed.
You know, Bob, one of the wonderful things about emotional intelligence is that we can actually increase our emotional intelligence. We don't need more brain cells. We need different behaviors.
Yeah.
And we can become so much more effective in working with other human beings when we work on our emotional intelligence very mindfully. Now, I want to go back to something you said earlier. It's worth repeating. You sometimes tell people that they can learn to ask questions in only 30 seconds. Please explain how and why that works.
Well, Roger, I've kind of shared bits and pieces of it already, but whenever I speak, I ask my audience, who here would like to learn to lead with questions in 30 seconds? And every
Right.
hand goes up.
Sure.
And then I call somebody from the audience up, and as they come up, I say, hey, I chose Roger because I sense Roger has a photographic memory. And usually that person's shaking their head like, no, I don't have a photographic memory. And I said, well, I actually think you do. And I find someone in the audience who has a second hand on their watch to be our timer. And I say, okay, here we go. And my first favorite question is, what do you think? Second, what else? Third, what else? Fourth, what else? I ask them, do you have them memorized? They always do. I say, share them with us. And they say, what do you think? What else? What else? What else? I say, timer. And usually it's like 15, 16 seconds. And I say, we just have a new world record. And then I say, now some of you in the audience look a little skeptical, like, Bob, you can't ask somebody, what do you think? What else? What else? What else? And I said, well, not in that rapid fashion. This is a conversation. And the first thing the leader is going to do is, hey, what do you think about? There's going to be a topic. And when you ask, they're going to answer. But as I shared earlier, that first answer instinctively is testing the waters.
Right.
So if I ask you, Roger, hey, what do you think about? And you give me that first answer, and I say, well, Roger, that's stupid. Everyone knows that. You're sorry you answered. Next time I ask, I'll get nothing. But when I say, wow, Roger, that's really good. What else? Well, you relax and you give me more. And then instead of moving on, I'm likely to grab a pen and say, Roger, I've got to take notes. Please continue. What else? And I find that you actually get to their best thought, what I call their gold nugget, with the third and fourth question. And I share the story of the proverbial gold miner, the old guy who mined for gold all his life looking for the gold vein. He never found it. He finally quits. Somebody came along later and discovered the old miner was within 6 inches of the gold vein when he quit.
Oh.
Well, if you only ask somebody, what do you think about, get their first answer and move on, you're a bit like that gold miner. You got close, but you got to do the digging a little further. What else? Tell me more about that. Say more. That digging to get to their gold nugget. And again, going back, the promise of this question is, who here would like to learn to lead with questions in 30 seconds? And Roger, I always share that one of the things I love about leading with questions is so many of the greatest questions are so simple. They're not long, complicated, like, how would I ever memorize that or remember to ask it? So for a leader who's only been a teller, in their next meeting with one of their staff, one-on-one, or with their team around their conference table, whatever the issue is on the table, by just saying, hey, Roger, what do you think? And listening. Wow, that's good. Say more about that. And the what else is, that leader can move from being a leading by telling to leading with questions just with these 4 questions. Are there some other questions? Sure. But it's actually that simple. I go back to Bill Marriott, 4 most important words in the English language. What do you think?
Right.
Kind of thing.
So in what ways, Bob, can the same questioning strategies used productively in the workplace be applied productively with personal friends or at home with spouses and children?
Yeah.
Same methodology?
It is. It's the same methodology. And another thought I have, and this is workplace or home, but here's something I learned from a mom. She said every day when her daughter came home from school, she'd say, "Honey, how was school today?"
Right.
And she said, "I get at best a one-word answer. Okay, fine, boring, but one word and done." And one day, she was thinking, I'm frustrated with these conversations. But then she began to think, but it's not my daughter's fault. It's that I need a better question. And so that day when her daughter came home from school, she said, "Honey, tell me about your day today." And she said, at first, I wasn't sure she heard me. But then she began to speak. And for the next 10 minutes, my daughter went on everything throughout the day. And the mother inside went, "Yes, better question, better answer." And so the difference between understanding that first question, any question that could be answered with one word, is a closed question. Now, they're not wrong. There's times that, asking a closed question is appropriate. But there's other times, if you're wanting to have a conversation, you want to ask questions that can't be answered in one word. Now, that mom's question, "Hey, tell me about your day," there's not a guarantee that they're going to get a long answer, but you're improving the chances of it.
Yes.
And that kind of thing. My son, who has a small business, and we have a great relationship, and many times we went to lunch, I'd say, "Bill, how's business?" And I'd get a one word, "Okay, challenging, fine," but one word and we're done. And then I read this somewhere. It was a better question. And so the next time I went to lunch, I asked this better question. I said, "Bill, I'm curious. How's business this year in comparison to last year?" And that day I got a 15-minute answer. And I went, "Yes, better question."
Right.
And so sometimes, the comparison is that, "Hey, how was school? Hey, how's school as a junior versus last year when you were a sophomore? What's different?" And you're pulling out more. And again, listening and, creating that. So many of the principles are identical in terms of leading with questions, asking questions, listening.
Well, there's no doubt that good questions are important. So let me ask this one. What one question have you asked yourself recently that had a significant impact on your thinking or decisions?
The question I've been asking myself is, how can I multiply myself times 10? And the reason I've landed on that question is, many times we think, how can I improve? We come up with the answer, "Oh, I just need to work a little harder."
Mm-hmm.
And get that 10% more production, 10% more results. But the question of how can I multiply myself by 10 can't be answered with, "I just have to work harder." The answer is, I've got to do something different.
Right.
And so that's been a motivational question for me. And I've been working on and actually have answers and a plan that I'm executing on multiplying myself times 10. That's the question I've been asking myself. So thanks for asking.
Well, you've just emphasized that it's important to ask ourselves smart questions.
Yes.
Stimulates thinking.
Yes.
Well, Bob Tiede, thank you so much. I've loved our conversation, and I appreciate your spirit of generosity. Your insights into the value of good questions can benefit our listeners in every role of their lives. For those of you who would like to learn more from Bob, just go to leadingwithquestions.com. That's leadingwithquestions.com. And to grab a free copy of my book, Change Friendly Leadership, go to changefriendly.com. That's changefriendly.com. In other episodes of Leadership, I share my exclusive conversations with top thought leaders who offer smart tips to boost your effectiveness in both your professional and personal life. My guests include superstars like Stephen M.R. Covey, Liz Wiseman, Doug Conant, Dory Clark, Heather Younger, Marshall Goldsmith, Amy Edmondson, Bill George, Jessica Chin, Guy Kawasaki, David Ulrich, and many others who have insightful things to say that you can put to good use immediately. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can stay informed on what's coming your way. Trust me, folks, you don't want to miss any of our episodes. And feel free to leave comments, including any suggestions on future guests. Thanks again for joining us. Until next time, stay safe, be happy, and spread good cheer wherever you go. For Leadership, I'm Roger Dean Duncan.